Hello, this is Mr. Winton, and today I'm going to share with you guys a little lesson, a short part one of probably of 3 parts on major macromolecules that are found in living systems. And there are 4 major groups of these macromolecules, 4 main classes, and we're going to go through each one. Today we're probably primarily going to cover the first one, carbohydrates. So when we think of carbohydrates, of course we think of, let's get down here, let's see, we think of glucose is a common carbohydrate that we're familiar with. Pardon the handwriting, it's not easy writing on this. Another one that we're probably familiar with are starches, and there's some more that we're going to talk about, but that's just a couple to introduce it to you. The second group that we're going to mention, and it will be in the second part, are lipids. And of course we know lipids are good examples of lipids are fats and oils are lipids. The third one that we're going to deal with are proteins. Hopefully we'll get that in the second part too. And proteins really are extremely important. One of the main proteins in our body that we talk about are enzymes, but there's other proteins in our body used for storage of energy, used for movement, things like that, for defense. Lots of things going on with proteins, and we'll talk about all those later on. It just makes up a huge amount of us, proteins do. And the last one that we're going to mention, it will be in part 3 definitely, is nucleic acids. And hopefully that sounds familiar. The nucleic acid you might have heard of in the molecule of DNA. So we know that the N and the A in DNA stands for nucleic acid. And another molecule that we're going to spend some time on is RNA. So those are some of the major macromolecules, and a little bit just introduction to them all. So before we get into those, though, we need to talk about what is a polymer. A polymer is just a long chain of repeating subunits, basically, is what that is. Okay, long molecule consisting of many similar building blocks or repeating subunits. And when we talk about these 4 groups, 3 of the 4 actually we would consider those polymers. The first one being carbohydrates is a polymer. The second one that we're going to talk about is a polymer of proteins. They're long subunits of proteins. And then the third one, which is a polymer, is DNA. Lipids, not so much a polymer, so we won't mention that, but we need to know some basics. All 3 of those that I mentioned, a generic term for them would be a polymer. Hopefully that makes sense. A little bit more about polymers. They are made up of building blocks called monomers. So mono meaning one. So we have these individual one building blocks. We connect several of those monomers together to make poly, meaning many. And so a couple things we need to know about polymers is how they're formed, or the synthesis of them, and how they're broken down. So the way they're formed, look, if you look at this picture here, it really, I think, helps visualize it. If we look at that, let's do this color. What's going on here? So we have 2 monomers. We have one right here. Okay, we have one monomer right here, and we have the other one right here. Okay. Now, if you'll notice on each one of those monomers, on one side we have a hydrogen, little atom of hydrogen there, and the other one we have this OH. That OH right there is called, it has a specific name, it's called a hydroxyl group. Alright, and so these will all have this OH. One side will have an OH on it, and the other side will have a hydrogen. Just like in this picture here, you'll see the OH on one side and the H on the other side. So what happens in this, let's clear that off. What happens here is a hydrogen from one molecule is going to be taken, and the OH from another molecule is going to be taken and forming water, H2O. Energy is going to be put into this too for this to happen, and so this is called a dehydration synthesis reaction. So we're taking water out to form this molecule. So that's where you get this dehydration of taking water out and forming this molecule. So just the opposite of that takes place when we have to break down those molecules. So down here, if you'll look, to break these molecules down, we have this molecule here that's got it's held together by these bonds, And when we add water to it right here, when we add this water to it, that one of those hydrogens is going to go to one molecule, and the other hydrogen and the oxygen will go to the other. Now when we break those bonds, we're going to release energy, and that process is called hydrolysis, of adding water to a polymer to break it down into simpler substances. And that is a major concept. Really, both of these play a major role. Later on we'll talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. We look at photosynthesis as a dehydration synthesis. We're putting these building blocks together. We're making glucose, and we're making these other polymers, and so that's kind of it's a good example of dehydration synthesis. Whereas hydrolysis, we think of with cellular respiration. We're going to be breaking those things down and releasing energy. And so we'll approach that much more later on. So let's go ahead and clear that and go on to the next thing. So let's talk about carbohydrates first. So we're familiar with carbs. We hear about carbs. We think of bread and donuts and candy and pop, all the things that we love to eat that taste so good. But we need to talk a little bit about carbs. There's some specific types of carbohydrates out there that are very important biologically speaking. So in general, there's some basics of them. Over here we have a, let's use this color since we're dealing with plants here for these first ones here. We think about glucose. I can't help but think of plants and photosynthesis. But a monomer of a carbohydrate is this molecule called a monosaccharide. So we think of glucose. Glucose is an example of a monosaccharide. So it's a building block. It's a simple unit of a carbohydrate. It's a simple carbohydrate. Now, if we add two monosaccharides together, glucose being one and fructose the other, we get this molecule called a disaccharide. And you're familiar with disaccharides in that is sucrose, which is sugar, table sugar. So that's considered. These are both considered simple carbohydrates. Now, when we connect together several monosaccharides, like glucose molecules, when we connect several of them together, here, and here, we get a polysaccharide. So that poly meaning many monosaccharides bonded together form this polysaccharide. And we're going to spend a little more time talking about polysaccharides. So the first polysaccharide that we want to talk about are these storage polysaccharides. They're good for storing energy. In plants, you're familiar with that very much. We've heard about starches. We're familiar with starches. We know about starches in potatoes and things like that, and carrots and beets and turnips, things like that have those big storage reservoirs of starch in them, and that's energy for that plant, for storage energy. Of course, we benefit from it too, because when we eat it, we can break that down and we can get energy from that. The other one you're probably not as familiar with is a substance called is a polysaccharide called glycogen. And it's kind of funny, we're not as familiar with it but it actually is what's found in our bodies. It's our form of starch, so to speak, and it's found in liver, and your muscle cells have a lot of glycogen in them, and it's just like a little storage reservoir for energy. That's a carbohydrate that your body can use, and your body loves these storage polysaccharides because, and same way with starches, your body loves them because they're a quick energy source. It's really the body's preferred energy source. We can break them down really quickly for energy, and we're good, and we like those. We don't have to take hours to break those down. They're a quick source of energy. So another type of polysaccharide that we want to mention are the structural polysaccharides. A good example of that is cellulose. Cellulose is found in the cell walls of plants. In fact, they're the main component of plant cell walls. And their job is to give structural support for that plant, because plants don't have a backbone, so they need those cell walls to give them support. So I'm going to kind of explain this to you a little bit about cellulose and the importance of it and what it means to us. So when we look at glucose, there's two formations of these glucose structures. You have over here you have a alpha glucose formation, and you have a beta glucose. And the alpha glucose, you'll notice this hydroxyl group is kind of on the bottom side of this carbon here. Okay, it's kind of pointing down. This beta glucose molecule, the hydroxyl group, is pointing up. It's on the top side of that carbon right there. There's a carbon molecule right there that's on the top side of that. So when we look at starch, starch is composed primarily of alpha glucose monomers. So that OH is going to be on the bottom on each one of those on the bottom side. You see that across there? We have enzymes in our body that can break those down just fine. It can go in there, break those starch polysaccharides down into monosaccharides, and then eventually your body would break that glucose down into energy through cellular respiration. And we don't have any problems. Everything's good. We like starch. We like to eat it. It's a good source of energy. But when it comes down here to cellulose, you'll notice that this hydroxyl group, it's on the top side on every other monomer there, on every other glucose monomer. And so we really don't have the enzymes that can break those down because they're not all lined up there on the bottom like they are in starch. So what does that mean for us? Well, when we eat plants, we have a hard time breaking down that cellulose that's in the cell wall. Now, some animals don't have a problem with that. We think of herbivores out there like cows and other things that eat plants, and they have a number of things that can help them. They'll have more than one different chambered. They'll have more than one chambered stomachs. Cows chew their cud, but one of the main things that they have that really helps them break this down is they have bacteria that live in their gut, and the bacteria that live in their gut will secrete. They produce the enzymes that can break this stuff down, so they can get the energy from it that we can't. So what does that mean to us? We think about, there's a good picture of this cellulose that's found in the cell walls, and you can see all these long strands of polysaccharide, long strands of monosaccharides bonded together, and really give that plant, that cell wall, strength and support, and provided a lot of stability. What does that mean to us? We go in here and I like to think of corn. So we love to eat corn. We love corn on the cob, and the thing we don't, one thing that we don't like to talk about is when we eat corn, we can't break that cellulose down very well. It's in all those seeds, in all those kernels. So there's probably, if you're eating that corn, there's probably a good chance you'll see it again. I'll leave it at that. So that's going to be the end of this lesson. So hopefully you go to our next one. We'll get into lipids. So I'll see you later. Bye.